his subject for today. Is prescribed fire compatible with conservation of butterflies and other pollinators? And just a bit about Ray. He is currently working with the Department of Zoology at Oklahoma State University. His focus is on the response of soil and litter invertebrates to fire. Ray received his PhD also at Oklahoma State in 2010, where he was focusing specifically on the effect of fire and grazing on butterflies. And just a bit about the environment. If you haven't attended a webinar through Adobe Connect before, the chat box, I think you may have already discovered in the lower left-hand side of the screen. You can type your questions in there, and we'll try to answer those at the end of Ray's presentation. The participants, you'll all be muted throughout the presentation, so we avoid conflicts there. And if you happen to have problems, you lose the feed or something like that, please just write in the chat box and I'll be monitoring that. So without further ado, Ray, I'm going to let you go ahead and dig right in.
Well, thank you, Sherry. Let me just ask, is the volume appropriate still?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, very good. Very good. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you. Pleasure to be talking with you. Yes, this is a topic dear to my heart for years, for numerous years now. Let's see, I need to remember how to use okay, got it. The format of today's talk, the focus, of course, is burning good or bad for insect pollinators, factors to consider when addressing that question. I'm going to identify some controversies and some data gaps, and I think there are many data gaps, and preparing this webinar really made me think of just how much more research we need to do on this topic. Also, I'll provide some management recommendations at the end that I can already will be unhappy with, and I'm already unhappy with some of them, I guess, but we can discuss that.
Oh, Ray, can I stop you for a second? It sounds like you need to turn up your mic just a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Okay, let's see. Turning up the mic. Yes. So everybody, you won't hear me for about 10 or 15 seconds as I adjust the mic upward. Okay. Hopefully it's not too loud. Does that sound good to you, Sherry? Sherry, do you hear me?
Yep, I do. I think you're okay, and we'll get some feedback in the chat box here in a second.
Very good. Sounds good out there.
Okay.
That's good news. Okay. Okay. Of course, I want people to participate with questions after I chat, after I give a presentation for about 35, 45 minutes. I'll address the questions that you folks pose in the chat box. Please feel free to challenge any so-called facts that I present, my interpretations, and my recommendations. I'm fairly humble, and a lot of this stuff is worthy of discussion. I like to view this topic as a prairie pollinator paradox. That's something, it's the main reason why I've been excited about this topic for the last 6 or 7 years. And the paradox is that many of you know, especially folks in the prescribed fire community know, that the Great Plains ecosystems, especially eastern tallgrass prairie, had fire, frequent fire for millennia. It was an integral part of the ecosystem. And yet we have species, we have prairie species like the Orogo skipper on the left, like the regal fritillary on the right. Yeah, my pointer's working. These species, which are dependent on prairie and yet sensitive to fire, and sometimes harmed by fire. Of course, at least in my opinion, the paper that really brought a lot of people's attention to negative effects of fire was a paper by Swengel back in 1996 in Biological Conservation. And this paper inspired me to go into this line of research. And in that paper, Anne reported that prairie specialists were less abundant in recently burned areas than in areas that had been burned many years before, and that prairie specialists were more abundant in hayed areas than burned areas. So her interpretation of that was, hey, prescribed fire can be dangerous to our prairie butterflies. Haying appears to be a better management practice in prairies as far as prairie endemic butterflies are concerned. And the prairie specialist butterflies she was talking about were included these six: Orogo skipper. My arrow's not working, I apologize. There it goes. Orogo skipper, regal fritillary, Leonard skipper, Oto skipper, some people pronounce it Otoe skipper, Powashik skipperling, Dakota skipper. I'll let you know up front, I only have personal experience with these three on the left, Orogos, Regal, and Oto, because these are the ones most likely to be found more in the southern prairies, Kansas and Missouri. Okay. Back to the prairie pollinator paradox, what's paradoxical is how did those pollinator populations persist in those ecosystems that had fire for so long? And I think most of you have probably already figured out the solution to that, which is that these pollinator populations, whether butterflies or bees, existed as metapopulations, large, expansive metapopulations that spread over broad areas, so that when a fire occurred, you would have recolonization from other portions of the metapopulation, from unburned areas into the burned areas, or quite likely there were unburned refugia within burned areas from which recolonization could occur. What about now? What about these days? Well, we don't have that many huge fires anymore in prairies, but we don't have many pollinator metapopulations that are vast because we don't have that many vast prairies anymore. So do the burned areas get recolonized? That, of course, is a huge question. And can we use fire to manage prairie and conserve the pollinators? And both of those questions will be addressed in this talk. How can fire be harmful? I want to let you know this talk will be quite a bit of a review of the literature, not as much chatting about my own research as I normally do. How can fire be harmful? Well, direct effects of fire, direct mortality. Fire can incinerate the pollinators, particularly when they're in their immature stages. A quick review of butterfly life cycle. Of course, butterflies go from egg to larva to pupa to adult. Life cycle of a bee, quite similar, egg to larva, pupa to adult. Whether we're talking about butterflies or bees, 3 of these life stages, egg, larva, and pupa, are largely immobile and thus quite vulnerable to a fast-moving disturbance like a fire. The adults being less vulnerable, of course, to direct mortality due to their ability to fly away in most cases. So that if you have a larva of a regal fritillary in some prairie and you burn it, it's likely it gets incinerated. I don't have any personal experience in that I've never actually found any regal fritillary caterpillars that and put them out in grass and see them burn, but I think it's pretty clear that they're going to get burned up if they are above ground, and most people think that they are. How can fire be harmful? Well, also by indirect effects, and there are many of these. fire, many of these effects pretty much get categorized into two main categories. Indirect effects can be alteration of vegetation structure and alteration of the plant community composition. Vegetation structure includes nest availability. Fire can reduce nest availability. Leafcutter bees in the family Megachilidae typically nest in pre-existing cavities, in structures, in woody stems, but also in pithy forb stems, so that when a fire occurs, that can, of course, burn up the nests, killing what's inside, but also eliminating their availability for quite a while. Also, fire can reduce protection from predators. This prairie on the right is one that's quite tall. My research has indicated that the common wood nymph prefers to hang out in high-structured prairie. Composition doesn't seem to matter as much as structure. Why? Well, common wood nymphs are very tasty to birds. They're often used in research as a food item for birds, for those people studying predation upon butterflies. So they're quite tasty. They're not all that fast moving, and so it makes sense that they spend most of their time in tall vegetation, tall grassland. Fire, of course, will temporarily at least reduce sward height. You're not going to find as many wood nymphs in habitat like this simply because there's very little cover for them. Now, of course, during the summer, this grassland on the right, the grass will get higher and it'll become better habitat for common wood nymphs. Fire can reduce litter, of course. It can eliminate it entirely. Regal fritillary caterpillars probably spend the winter either in standing dead or in herbaceous litter. And therefore, a winter or spring burn is likely going to incinerate them. Jen Vogel from Iowa State, in her research with Diane Dubinsky, found a negative correlation between regal fritillary abundance and litter cover. And it makes sense that that would be the case. It makes sense that dense litter would protect those tiny caterpillars. But I also have questions. Is the litter actually that important, or is it simply the fact that the litter is correlated with time since fire? In Jen's research, she found very few regal fritillaries in recently burned sites, a lot of regal fritillary in sites that had not been burned in years. Of course, recently burned sites have no litter. Sites that haven't been burned in years have a lot of litter. Is the litter really a problem for the fritillaries, or is it simply time since fire? More indirect effects of fire. Of course, alteration of plant community composition. You can reduce or eliminate host plants and nectar sources temporarily or for years. This species, this butterfly species, is one which is sensitive to fire because fire can kill its host plant. The species is Calliferous grinius, also known as the juniper hairstreak. What's its host plant? Eastern red cedar. So when we kill eastern red cedar, we are eliminating the host plant for this species. Now, this species, to my knowledge, is not the least bit rare. So while it's sad for that butterfly and for people who love it, it's probably not one that we're going to put a lot of conservation attention toward. How can fire be helpful? In the same ways that it can be harmful in some of the same areas. Fire can help butterflies and bees by altering veg structure and by altering the plant community composition. Positive effects on vegetation structure I think were best shown with bee research by Simon Potts and his colleagues in Israel, doing research in a scrubland habitat called Fregana, which apparently is common in the Eastern Mediterranean. And in their work, they found mostly positive effects of fire on bee communities. And this picture shows a halictid bee, which is a ground nester. Fire increased the amount of bare ground, which it does in most ecosystems. And these bees love bare ground. They need bare ground for nesting. Therefore, fire increased the availability of nesting sites and increased the abundance and species richness of ground nesting bees. Positive effects of plant community composition. Well, in our tallgrass prairie, of course, we have lots of cedars invading, and I have done no research, nor am I aware of any that have shown negative effects of cedar on prairie butterfly abundance, but I certainly assume that once one gets to this state, that prairie endemic butterflies are no longer going to be finding this. Plains, southern plains, that's probably quite a positive impact on prairie specialist butterflies. Another example of a positive impact of fire is increasing host plant abundance, as shown by Kristen Baum, who is currently my supervisor at Oklahoma State. And Kristen did research here in Oklahoma showing that summer fire in Oklahoma prairies caused Asclepias viridis, this plant on the left, to resprout in late summer, providing host plant material for monarch butterfly caterpillars. Typically, this plant, Asclepias viridis, blooms in May and is dormant by July. But by burning in midsummer, again, that caused it to resprout, providing an abundance of food material for monarchs. And that paper was by Baum and Sharver, 2012. Another positive effect of fire on plant community composition is it sometimes greatly increases the abundance of nectar resources. It did exactly that in the Israel research that I spoke about a few minutes ago by Simon Potts, and it certainly has done that at a number of sites where I've worked in Missouri, Kansas, and Iowa. So a paper that we've got submitted right now talks about fire's positive effect on blooming of Echinacea pallida, pale purple coneflower, which is a fantastic nectar source for butterflies and also for bees in tallgrass prairie. Same thing happens with Liatris pycnostachya, prairie blazing star. This photo is taken at Niawatha Prairie in Missouri and shows an amazing bloom of this wonderful, wonderful nectar source in July, just 4 months after Sherry and some of her colleagues with the Missouri Department of Conservation at the time, after they burned that site. There were, I don't think this picture fully shows that there were many tens of thousands of flowering stems of that plant and many, many hundreds of butterflies. It was quite spectacular. So, is fire harmful or helpful to pollinators? And as my mentor at Oklahoma State often says, it depends. It depends on a lot of things. It depends. It's difficult to make lots of generalizations about fire because of species effects. Species respond differently due to their different life histories, including phenology, and due to differences in their natural history. habitat requirements, food requirements, and I'll go over some of these in detail. Life history does matter. This shows me burning a prairie in southern Iowa in March 2011. There were a few regal fritillary larvae in that prairie. How do I know? I could hear them screaming. Cruel joke, I know. It's tough for a guy like me to burn. I love burning. It's fascinating. It's fun. I know it's helping lots of resources. I know at the same time I'm probably killing some butterfly larvae. But it's part of the research program that we do. So again, back to this slide. This was in March 2011. This fire was probably killing some regal fritillary larvae. However, at that same time, this is a shot in Mexico of millions of monarch butterflies. So butterfly life history matters. Year-round residents, like the regal fritillary, suffer more exposure to dormant season fire than do the migrants. Unfortunately, to my knowledge, all of our prairie specialist butterflies are year-round residents, as opposed to monarchs, painted ladies, cloudless sulfurs, which are generalist species, which are migratory. Another problem that I believe we have is believe it or not, with butterflies even, there is a dearth of detailed life history information. For some of the species, we don't know exactly where the immature forms reside, so that creates a little bit of uncertainty as to what's going to happen to them when we burn. For instance, where do regal fritillary caterpillars spend the winter? Are they on the standing dead? Are they in the litter? Are they underground? If any of you folks out there know that, please be sure to put that in the chat box. I reread papers by Copper recently, Brian Copper, who did the most research that I know of on regal fritillary larvae, and couldn't find the exact answer to this question. We also have a dearth of natural history information. What habitats are they found in? What do they prefer to eat? And two species that I work with a lot, great spangled fritillary, common wood nymph. Do they overwinter in the woodlands of southern Iowa, which we do not burn? Or do they overwinter in the prairies, which we do burn? I don't know the answer to this. If folks out there do, again, please let me know. But we need to get more natural history information to better answer some of these questions. Bee life history and natural history information. Unfortunately, very few of the world's bee species migrate. Therefore, that increases their exposure. Their lack of migration increases their exposure to negative effects of fire in the prairies. However, fortunately, 70% of our bee species nest underground, providing them some protection from fire. Much of the rest of the bee species nest in above ground cavities or in pithy hollow stems like this horn-faced bee. Those species, of course, do become more vulnerable to direct negative effects of fire. Okay, I've talked about species factors. Now I'm going to talk about factors of the fires themselves, fire variables that can influence how pollinators are affected by fire. And the first one I want to talk about is completeness of burn. And this slide shows a pasture in southern Iowa, so far south actually, that while this is Iowa, at the bottom of the photo, this hillside adjacent to it is Missouri. So the border is right down here. Anyway, what I show you here are some ornithologists doing some work at the Lee Trail pasture, which we burned in its entirety in January of 2009. So my expectation was we would not find any regal fritillary butterflies at this site. To my shock, one morning, this fellow here called me to say, hey, we have lots of regal fritillaries at the Lee Trail pasture. And I didn't believe him, but he insisted. So I ran out to sea, and these ornithologists were dragging rope to find bird nests, and that's a very, very important part of the story. Okay, they stretch out the rope and drag it along the ground. That's what was causing regal fritillaries to fly up. The regal fritillaries they found were extremely fresh. These butterflies had wings that were practically wet. They could barely fly at all. We were able to walk up to them and catch them with our hands. We didn't even need a net. Well, what does that mean when regal fritillaries are so fresh? That means that they just came out of their chrysalids. That means that they survived the fire. These regal fritillaries, caterpillars, had been in that prairie over winter and had survived the fire. How did they survive the fire? I asked my friends, I happened not to be present at that fire that year. How did the fire go? And they said, well, we had some patches right around here that didn't burn very well. It was a fire that looked somewhat like this. The black, of course, showing areas that did burn, but there were some areas that didn't burn. Why not? Well, those areas didn't burn because those areas had invasive tall fescue. Research by Devin McGranahan, one of my colleagues, showed that tall fescue impedes fire spread. Well, that's what happened in this case, and that actually turned out to be a boon for the regal fritillaries. The presence of that cool season grass hindered the fire, providing small unburned refugia for regal fritillaries to survive. However, in 2012, when that prairie was burned again, fire completeness was near 100%. Why? Well, this is just an interesting thing, I think, about the interaction of fire and grazing. We reduced cattle stocking rates at that pasture in 2010 and 2011, which increased the fuel load in 2012. With a greater fuel load, we had greater completeness of burn. With greater completeness of burn, we found no regal fritillaries whatsoever emerging there in 2012, even though we did lots of rope dragging at that site, even though we tried to scare them up. Now, eventually, later that summer, we did see some regal fritillaries. They recolonized the site from unburned areas nearby. But this, to me, is an interesting example of the potential value of unburned refugia within a burn unit. Excuse me, I need to take a quick drink. Okay, season of burn is an important factor. Burning in summer, of course, can have very different effects from burning in the dormant season. In the summer, many of the pollinators will be active adults, so they can fly off if they need to. But a question you have to ask yourself, if you're burning in summer, do they have anywhere else to go? Is there any other habitat nearby that they could occupy, where they could find sustenance? And what about immatures? There are going to be some immatures, in all likelihood, of some species that get killed by a summer burn. So summer burns may be better for some species, but they're not going to be better for everything. If you do burn in summer, you're likely to get at least a short-term increase in nectar availability and host plant biomass. You're going to burn those things up. But these usually recover quite quickly. An example of this, best example I know of, is research from North Florida by Sharon Herman and Tanya Van Hook, from when those two were at Tall Timbers. I apologize for the slide being cut off a little bit, but these ladies found out that burning in May or June, burning in summer, decreased the flower production of the species on the left, Seimeria cassioides, but it greatly increased flower production of Liatris, spicata in the fall. And increased blooming of Liatris spicata meant that there was more nectar for monarch butterflies during their fall migration. So that was a positive impact of summer burning. The only, I'm not aware of any other season of burn research with pollinators in the prairie, except a study by Kenny Wallen, Kristen Baum, and Sam Fuhlendorf at Oklahoma State. And in that research, which I just found out about recently, they compared July burns to winter burns, and they did find a significant effect of season of burn on bee abundance. I apologize that I do not know the direction of that effect at this point. I need to talk to my boss about that. Of greatest interest to a lot of us is proportion of area burned. And I'm going to give my representation of viewpoints of various leaders in this field. First, the views of Ann and Scott Swengel, two researchers in Baraboo, Wisconsin. Ann and Scott warn against burning entire sites, but also about the danger of rotational burning. Thank you, Sherry. Ann and Scott suggest burning 1/5 to 1/10 of an area each year. Quite conservative compared to most prairie managers, who many of whom burn 1/3 of a unit per year, or maybe even the entire unit. In a very interesting paper in 2007, Ann and Scott proposed leaving unburned refugia, small areas within a preserve that you never ever burn. Just designate them as an area that never gets burned. The rationale behind that being, maybe there are some species that are fantastically intolerant of fire. Let's provide some habitat for them. Now, of course, I recognize that one would need to have some other management practice in those areas to deal with encroachment of woody plants. And if there was no other practice that was able to get rid of woody plants successfully, then this would not work. Views of the Xerces Society, if I may be so bold, I see that we have folks from the Xerces Society here. But some of the views that they presented in a wonderful book, fantastic book that came out recently on conservation of pollinators. They recommend burning 30% of a site or less. Recommend 5 to 10 years between burns. That's what it takes for recovery of pollinator populations. The title of that book, Attracting Native Pollinators, Protecting North America's Bees and Butterflies, the Xerces Society Guide. Great book. Strongly recommend it. Dr. Ron Panzer's work, primarily from the Chicago area. Ron has his papers give a very different story. His work really emphasizes the fact that, yes, while some prairie specialists decrease the year of burn, most of them recover quite quickly, many of them by 1 year post-fire. And of course, some prairie species respond positively to fire, even during the year of the burn. And I think this wraps it up. This is a good statement, representation of his beliefs. My results support the judicious use of rotational cool season burning within small, isolated grassland sites. So this is very much counter to some of the thoughts of Ann and Scott Swengel. Dr. Mark Schwartz of UC Davis is a colleague of Ron Panzer, co-author on some papers. And I found a very interesting letter that he wrote back in 1998, presenting criticisms of Ann Swengel's early papers. And Ann wrote a response back. But one of the most interesting things he wrote there was that there is a lack of documented extinctions of butterflies, despite all the fire management that's happening. So Dr. Schwartz comments are more in line with those of Ron Panzer, that we don't need to worry about fire that much. So now I'll present a little bit of my research and how that relates to these viewpoints towards how much of an area can you burn. I did research in Kansas between, I believe, 2007 and 2010 at the Homestead Ranch in Chase County, Kansas, a fantastically beautiful area in the Flint Hills. And that study involved large pastures in intact prairie landscape, and the comparison there was between pastures that were burned in a 3-year rotation that had cattle versus cattle pastures that were burned every spring. For those of you who don't know, the Flint Hills has approximately 5 million acres of native tallgrass prairie, and 80 to 90% of that gets burned each year. Pretty amazing. So it's amazing that there's that much prairie. It's amazing that there's that much fire. I certainly believed going into it that burning these sites in their entirety every spring was quite bad for prairie butterflies, and I think we found that to be the case. Here, oh gosh, my data don't show up. I apologize for that. I was not aware that would happen, but I could give you, actually this shows it. Whoops, I'm sorry. This shows the same story. The only species of all the butterfly species that we looked at, and there were probably 20 or 30, the only species that showed a response, a treatment response, was the regal fritillary. The more common butterflies, whether they were burned, whether a site was burned in its entirety, or whether a site was only burned, 1/3 of it was burned, that didn't seem to matter much. But for regal fritillaries, it did matter. You could see that in 2007, in annually burned pastures, regal fritillary abundance was very, very low, 0.8 per kilometer of transect. In 2010, approximately the same number. Very few regal fritillaries in annually burned pastures. However, in patch burn grazed pastures, pastures that had a 3-year fire rotation, numbers were pretty darn low in 0 years since fire, but still higher than these. But you can see 1 year after fire and 2 years after fire, much larger numbers of regal fritillaries. So regal, obviously, to me it appears obvious, the fire is having a negative effect on the regal fritillaries, but they are recolonizing these pastures that are burned on a 3-year rotation. So from that I conclude that in these sites in Kansas, at least as far as the regal fritillary goes, that 3-year fire rotation works pretty well. They handle it pretty well. Also, these same sites had Orogo skippers. They had, I believe, Oto skippers, some other rare prairie skippers. So that's good news. A study I did in Missouri, southern Missouri, that Sherry, Lise, our host, worked on and helped to set up. I compared patch burn grazed pastures to patch burn ungrazed pastures to look at their effects on butterfly abundance. Once again, I just talking about regal fritillaries, that's certainly my favorite butterfly. Oops. Oh, and once again, the graphics aren't showing up. That's a bizarre, the graphics were certainly there in the PowerPoint, but they're not showing up now. But to summarize, there was a 3-way interaction of fire, grazing, and time since burn. Fire in a grazed pasture caused the cattle to go into the burned area and eat almost all the vegetation there. A few weeks after the burn, you had fresh, nutritious regrowth, and the cattle spent almost all summer in that area, ate almost all the vegetation, including the flowers, and there were virtually no regal fritillaries and no nectar sources. The cattle stayed out of the other patches, and we did have decent numbers of regal fritillaries in the other patches of those grazed pastures. On the other hand, in ungrazed pastures, I'll go back a slide. In the ungrazed pastures, patches that got burned in spring had very large numbers of regal fritillaries that summer, especially in July. Why? Well, almost certainly due to the very positive effects of the fire on blooming of Liatris pycnostachya, the prairie blazing star. And we got that result 2 years in a row. Fire was stimulating the bloom of nectar sources and increasing the number of regal fritillaries within that year's burn patch. I do strongly suspect the fire in this burn patch kills a whole bunch of larvae, but the patch is fairly quickly recolonized from neighboring sites. And now quickly, a little bit of information on my research in southern Iowa in the Grand River grasslands with Diane Dubinsky at Iowa State. Once again, the graphics are not showing up. To summarize these graphics, all three species I looked at, wood nymphs, monarchs, and regal fritillaries, had higher numbers the summer of a burn than they did the previous year. I think the same thing is happening in southern Iowa that was happening in southern Missouri. Fire is stimulating the blooming of nectar sources, drawing butterflies into those areas. However, fire isn't always great in those sites. This is a photo of the Edwards hair streak taken in 2010 from the Lee pasture in Iowa. Saw this same species in 2011 on the precise same individual butterfly milkweed plant. This butterfly absolutely loves butterfly milkweed. However, in 2012, no Edwards hair streaks. 2012, you'll remember, is the year of the very complete, 100% complete burn at Lee Trail. And I suspect, though cannot prove, that that fire, that complete burn, wiped out Edwards hair streaks from that pasture in 2012. Again, that's just a suspicion, no way to prove it. But I did lots of field work there in 2012, found no Edwards hair streak. Fortunately, 2013, we didn't burn there in 2013, and the Edwards hair streaks are back. So fairly quick recolonization of the site. Again, reviewing Mark Schwartz's comment that there was a lack of documented extinctions despite fire management. Well, that was 1998. In the 15 years since then, I think folks are documenting. There have been documented local extinctions because of fire management. Now, the one I just mentioned, I don't think really counts with the Edwards hair streak. That butterfly recolonized the site after just a year. I do not have any personal, from my research, any evidence of populations being extirpated for long periods of time. But I do believe information sent to me or told to me by Dennis Schlicht and other folks, other butterfly researchers from further north, from Iowa, from Minnesota, talking about species getting wiped out by fire. Orogo skipper is a species, for instance, that apparently hasn't been seen in Iowa in years. And Dennis Schlicht has done surveys there for many years, and they've disappeared from many of their sites. There's no certainty that it was due to fire, but it seems likely to me. And of course, these are the 6 species that Anne Swengel talked about in her 1996 paper. And Orogo skippers are doing quite poorly these days. Regal fritillaries have disappeared from many Iowa prairies. Leonard skippers are not doing great up there, Oto skippers. And then these 2 species, unfortunately, are doing so poorly that they were just proposed for ESA protection on October 23rd, just last week. Pretty important news. And both of these species are vulnerable to fire. And I'm pretty sure it's Dr. Dana's research from Minnesota that on Dakota skipper. That's lots of interesting information about the effects of fire on that species. Dakota skipper being proposed as threatened, and Powesheet skipperling proposed as endangered. So, is prescribed fire compatible? It can be, but it depends. Here are take-home messages. Part 1, there are going to be 5 slides of take-home messages. Of course, species vary in their response. Some are going to be positively affected by fire, some are going to be negatively affected. Prairie specialist butterflies are going to be more vulnerable to fire than migratory butterflies or generalist butterflies. But those same butterflies will be especially sensitive to woody plants. So it's quite a conundrum. We have, from what I can tell, there are very, very few data on the responses of prairie bees to fire. So I think that's a huge area of further research. Ground nesting bees in our region might be greatly helped by fire, given that fire can increase the amount of bare ground for them. Though Chris Helzer points out in his excellent book, Chris's book is The Ecology and Management of Prairies, points out that when you burn a large area, that can get rid of so many nectar plants that might starve the bees for a while, because bees might not be as ready to get up and move as butterflies are. Of course, fire factors affect responses. Incomplete burns are an asset to butterflies and other pollinators. So if you can, leave skips, small unburned areas within burn units. That's not the easiest thing to do, though. We need more research on summer burns. I certainly think, as an insect conservationist, that it would be foolish to ever burn 100% of any burn unit in the same year. If a remnant is very small and isolated, consider going with the Xerces Society recommendation, burning a small proportion of that area. The larger landscapes, it does seem that that the butterflies, at least, prairie specialist butterflies, can better tolerate fire, more frequent fire than 1/5 to 1/10 of an area. Yes, indeed. Here it is again. 3-year fire return interval seems to be working pretty well, but still more research and analysis needed to conclude that definitively. Butterflies and bees also appear to tolerate pyrrhic herbivory. Pyrrhic herbivory is the response of cattle, the interaction between grazers like cattle and bison to fire, as long as stocking rate is low enough. Because if stocking rate is really high, cattle stocking rates are really high, that has a negative effect on butterflies and their nectar sources. And I believe this is my final take-home message slide. from what I can tell, from what I hear, the prairie specialist butterflies are doing worse up north, and I think we should figure out why. Is it because there's too much fire up there? I suspect it's that in most cases the prairies up there are a bit smaller than down here in Oklahoma, Missouri, and Kansas, and that when burns are occurring, there's less opportunity for recolonization of burn sites. And of course, the Oklahoma bee research team. I didn't participate in that research at all, so I thank Dr. Baum and others for sharing their slides.
Thank you very much, Ray.
Well, thank you, Sharon.
We've got a few minutes for questions, and I want to try to get some in before people start to drop out. And I think while you're trying to answer a couple of these, I might try to share my screen so people can see some of those data slides. So we'll see if we can get that worked out. But there were a couple of comments about patch burn grazing when you were talking about the Lee Trail area, and I think you may have addressed how that works in as a potential management scheme. But there were a couple of thoughts there asking about the drought in 2012 and if that would have had some impact on the abundance of butterflies.
Oh, it's possible. It's possible. It have an impact on butterfly abundance. By July, butterfly numbers crashed, and John Delaney, a graduate student at Iowa State, is working on analyzing that and writing that up. Butterfly numbers of all species pretty much crashed in mid-July, but in June numbers were still decent, and I don't think that's why we didn't see any Edwards hair streaks. I really don't think that was it, but I can't prove that.
Can you see the slide on my screen now?
I cannot.
You cannot.
Oh, now I can. Yeah,
okay,
I see the
all right. Okay. There's
good idea.
There's one of them. Okay, and one of the other questions was, what happens if a site is never burned?
Excellent question. I don't know. I haven't been on any. All the sites I've been on and done research at have had some burning. Assuming there's woody plant encroachment, if there's no other practice to get rid of woody plants, then I assume our prairie specialists blink out. So you need to have some means of getting rid of the woody plants. So hang, herbicides, something like that. Hang obviously will only work if you don't have large trees already. But I've been in many hay meadows in eastern Kansas that did have good numbers of, really high numbers of regal fritillaries and some regal skipper as well. So haying is a viable management practices in some cases, for sure.
Okay, and another question, and Pete, I'm not sure if I'm completely understanding what you're saying, but Pete Bowman was writing in about the South Dakota prairies and the lack of burning up there and how it relates to butterflies, and he had a question about the role of chemicals.
Well, I saw that question, and that's an area that I still haven't been to. So I earlier when I said I suspected it might be too much fire up there, well, he's bringing up good evidence that I'm wrong on that. Chemicals, I'm guessing he's thinking about pesticides, herbicides. Pesticides certainly would be a problem in killing butterflies, and then herbicides are known to be a problem in that they're Roundup Ready corn and stuff like that by getting rid of all the weeds, we don't have as many milkweeds as we did before. So that's certainly going to hurt the monarchs. Yeah, that's I'll be very interested to hear from folks up north what's happening to the species up there.
Okay, and it looks like, oh gosh, I'm sorry that keeps going off. I'm trying to look at the chat box and the webinar goes away. So I'll put that slide back up in a second. So P. Lynch is asking about intensity and fire severity and how that relates to the host nectar plants.
Total burn. Does that equate to burn severity, intensity? I think if I was saying if I said the term total burn, that meant trying to burn 100% of an area, trying to burn the entire unit. That does not necessarily equate to burn severity or intensity, just to what proportion of area gets at least some fire. Does burn severity and intensity affect the ability of host and nectar plants to survive? Sure, certainly it will. And yet, it does seem like most of our prairie plants are so well adapted to fire that it would have to be an exceptionally severe fire to eliminate our native prairie species. But from what I can tell, a generalization, the nectar plants are, in general, the really premier native nectar plants are helped by fire.
And I think looks like we have a couple more statements. One is, do you we need to look into your source for the percent of the Flint Hills burned every year?
I don't even think I have a valid source other than hearsay, other than what I remember being told, in class over the years. So okay. I appreciate being Shelley coming up with a figure that actually has a literature behind it. So I apologize for that, folks. I'm shocked that it's that low. I see the numbers 30 to 35%, and I'm quite shocked by that. But it's hard to believe that it's that low, but there are published data on that, so that supersedes what I said.
It looks like there's some more discussion going on about herbicides and how that relates. Does anybody else have any more questions for Ray? It looks like there's some typing going on. I'll give you a second.
Sure.
Well, Ray, were there any more of those? Do you know another of those data slides that didn't show up that you'd like me to try to put on the screen before we finish?
No, I think we're fine.
Was that one of them? I think that one.
That was one of them for sure.
Okay. Okay.
And it's a little complicated to explain due to the three-way interaction. And you can't see my cursor now. So yes, that was a data slide. Basically, what we found, the response to regal fritillaries depended on when you surveyed. And in early June, you had one thing happening, but in late July, you had something different. But the basic story that I told before, I think, is still valid, that the regal fritillaries fire increased the bloom of some nectar plants, which caused regal fritillaries to go into those areas.
Okay, Ray, it looks like we're starting to lose some of our audience, and it is 2 o'clock, so I want to give folks a chance to get on to other things. I'll remind you that we have been recording the webinar, and so you'll be able to check back at the Great Plains Fire Science Exchange website and our YouTube page, and we will post these up on there for you to access, and I'll make sure to send out a link through our newsletter to make you aware of that when we have it ready. Appreciate everyone sitting in on the webinar, and thanks again, Ray. Appreciate it.